You're listening to the Real Life Ostomy Podcast. Welcome to episode 3 of the Real Life Ostomy Podcast, Surgery and Recovery. Thank you for joining me for another episode. I'm your host, Jameson Sizz. Hi, hello, and welcome back. For a brief recap before I begin here for episode 3, in episode 2, I covered my initial 2 weeks of hospital stay where I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and where I was first treated for that. Where I left off there, I had just been told that my condition had deteriorated to a much more serious state, and I needed to be transferred to a new hospital, and I needed to have surgery. So that's where our last episode left off. To start this episode, I do want to mention that this is primarily the conclusion of the introductory part of my story as an ostomate. I know we've gone through this will be the 3rd episode now of my story, and after this, we'll be getting into more topic-related ostomy subjects where I will discuss different things relevant to life as an ostomate and not so much my story, because I know that's not necessarily interesting to everybody, but this is the conclusion of my introductory story. There will be some story-related episodes in the future, but after this one, we will be getting to more topic-related episodes. So, with that out of the way, where I left off, I was told that I needed to be transferred from the smaller hospital where I had been being treated for 2 weeks, and now I was going to a bigger hospital. So they call in an ambulance, and after a fairly short wait, it was only maybe an hour or 2 hours or so, and I'm waiting for this ambulance to arrive so I can go to this new hospital. And there was definitely a time of anticipation, waiting for this ambulance ride, this transfer. Things were progressing. Even though I was very, very sick, it was a time of anticipation, and I was curious as to what was going to happen next. And I wanted to get better. So everything was this waiting and wondering. So eventually this ambulance crew arrived. I was all packed up, and I was packed into the ambulance. And it was fairly late at night, too. It was probably close to 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And I was packed up into the ambulance, and I was driven about an hour away down to a much larger hospital where there were specialists, surgical specialists, and the like that could take care of my situation here far better than it's a smaller hospital that my condition had essentially outgrown because it had progressed to such a bad state with that toxic megacolon that I had mentioned last episode. So finally we arrive at this new hospital, and I'm brought up to my new room. I have my new check-in procedure, and they're getting me all set to go. And at this point, it's still quite late at night. I probably didn't arrive at this hospital until midnight or later. And obviously, I'm very, very sick at this point, too. So I'm all checked in. I'm really settling in for bed. There wasn't really going to be much happening until the morning, really. So they get me all set to go, and I sleep for the night as much as I can. It's very hazy how much I slept, but regardless, I went to bed, and I woke up fairly early, probably 6 in the morning, which is not atypical for the hospital, as you're often being awoken by early morning rounds or blood work or something like that. This was actually fairly amusing considering the circumstance. I wake up, and it's about, say, 6 in the morning, and I open my eyes, and there were so many people standing around my bed. It was at least half a dozen, maybe more, maybe 8 people standing around my bed. Surgical interns, doctors, interns, that sort of thing. There were the proper doctors and other sorts of folks, possibly nurses too. I don't even necessarily know what they all were. Probably most were students in some form going around with the doctors on their rounds in the morning. But I wake up and there's so many people standing around my bed. And I wake up and I'm somewhat alarmed by this. And then the doctor starts talking to me and is telling these students around them, oh, this patient has this condition, and they will be going in for surgery today, and so on and so forth. It was fairly amusing in a way, because there were so many people in my room standing around me. When I woke up, I was sort of startled by it all. So I wake up and have a fairly normal morning as they're getting me ready. And I believe, actually, I can't really seem to recall if it was before or after I met my surgeon, but I do know that I had some surgical prep where a ostomy nurse helped choose the site of my stoma, which is where your intestine is placed through your abdominal wall on your front side, and your stoma is then where your waste comes out. And they want to place it fairly accurately where it's going to work for you. And depending on if you have a colostomy or an ileostomy or another type of ostomy, the location of the stoma varies from your lower right side to lower left side and around. But mine ended up being on the lower right-hand side, as I was having an ileostomy. And I seem to recall the ostomy nurse asking about where my pant line was, about where the top of my pants usually are, my belt line. And I sort of indicated where I felt about my belt line typically is. And they marked with a marker on my skin just above that, about an inch above it, to know where about they wanted to put the stoma. As I understand it, with some folks, especially if you are expecting this kind of surgery, where I wasn't. This was an emergency surgery, so I had very little time to plan and prepare for this and even know what the hell I was getting into. It was so new to me. But some folks get a bit more time to decide on where their stoma is going to be placed, and then that way it is most functional for them in terms of clothing and that sort of thing. With my stoma, I don't feel like there was too much more variation as to where it could have been placed, but it ended up being in a place that was functional. It was above the pant line. My appliance hangs totally fine. It does interact poorly with, say, backpacks with a hip belt or a climbing harness and that sort of thing, but we can get into that more another time. But either way, I didn't have much time to really sort out exactly where my stoma was going to go and to plan and prepare. Maybe I wanted it a little higher or maybe even a little lower, whatever it was, so that it might work a little better with some of these circumstances. Maybe there wasn't too much more option. It's hard to say. But either way, they marked where it seemed best to put my stoma, and that was part of my surgical prep, at least in terms of consulting with me as to what's going to be done. And at this point, too, I'm still really not that familiar with what an ostomy is. I'm told that I have to have my colon removed and that I'm going to receive an ostomy, and I'm pretty stressed about this. Something about having the entire colon removed and getting this ostomy thing that I'm not even really familiar with what it is. It was fairly distressing. I can recall thinking, my life will never be the same. That was my main thought. And will I be able to live the same life that I have been up until now? There were so many questions on my mind, and I felt like my life was really going to change. And in a way, yes, it did. But at the same time, I was able to return to so many things that I didn't think I was going to be able to do again. But primarily, I was going into this surgery knowing very little about what an ostomy is and what my life would be like afterwards. So there was a lot of apprehension. And finally, I get to meet my surgeon. He comes into my room a few hours after I had that, where I woke up and had all those doctors and students standing around my bed. So a few hours later, it was probably somewhere around noon, roughly or so. My proper surgeon comes in, who would actually be doing my ostomy surgery and removing the colon and the whole shebang. He comes in and he's so friendly. He introduces himself and he says, I understand you're really, really sick, and I'm going to help you. I'm going to take care of you. Don't you worry about it. I'm going to get you taken care of. And this was really, really cool, too. And in fact, at times later, speaking about it actually got me a little bit choked up, where he said to me, "We need to get you into surgery because I know how sick you are, and we need to get you taken care of as soon as possible. And I'm going to go down to the operating room right now." And he said, "I'm going to throw my elbows around. I'm going to throw my weight around, and I'm going to get you in as soon as I can. It might be a couple or a few hours before we can get you in, but I'm going to do my best to get a spot for you, and we're going to get you in, and we're going to get you taken care of." And something about that really put me at ease because he was so much on my side, and he was fighting so much to get me the care I needed and to do this surgery that I so desperately needed at this point. So he leaves the room, and I expected to see him again maybe in a couple or a few hours. And he came back in probably, I don't know, it may have only been 15 or 20 minutes. It was not very long. And he says, "I threw my weight around down at the OR, and we're getting you in there right now. We're going to get you taken care of, and we're doing this thing." I was so blown away by that because he was so ambitious and was just getting it done. It was so cool. And at this point, I had so many apprehensions about the surgery, but at the same time, it put me at ease that I knew that this doctor not only very much knew what he was doing and had done this many times, and that he was advocating for me so strongly. But anyways, so he comes in, he tells me that we're ready to go. We're going to go right now. Before I know it, they're wheeling me down the hall, and we're moving on to the pre-op room and so on. I saw the anesthesiologist who got me all prepped. I remember waiting in this pre-op room. They were getting me worked up. I remember they were setting up the anesthesia and all of that, but I hadn't been given all of my pre-op drugs yet, especially not the anesthesia that would put me out real fast. But I had a few minutes of waiting down there in this pre-op room where I knew this was big and that really nothing... Well, I can't say nothing, but to me, it seemed like this was the big moment in which things were going to change. I was going to hopefully be better after this surgery, but this would be a very, very important moment in my life overall in which, for this point forward, my life would be different in some way. So I recall sitting or lying in this room and almost feeling like I'm floating at times. It was very eerie, and it could very well have been some of the drugs that I was on, pain medications and all of that. But there was this sense of anticipation, but knowing that I had a good team that was going to be working on me and working for me. And eventually they gave me the anesthesia, and I remembered no more after that point until I eventually woke up. Waking up from my surgery is not particularly clear in my mind, and that's fairly common. You're put out with a lot of drugs, and when you wake up, it's not like you snap to and everything is clear and everything is coherent. So my moment of waking up is certainly not particularly clear. But where I can remember back to, I seem to recall waking up, coming to, remembering where I was and what had happened, what was going on, remembering that I had gone in for surgery and now I must have had my surgery in that time of sort of blackness in between. And I think I lifted up my gown to look at the surgical site, and I had many staples up my abdomen from below my belly button to a little bit above it. Just to the left side of my belly button, I had this very large incision, and I think I counted somewhere around 18 staples that were buttoning me back up. And then just to my right-hand side was this ostomy appliance that the one that they give you in the hospital typically has a clear cover on it so that you can see into it and see how much material is in it. So I see this ostomy appliance for the first time, and I could see my stoma as well through the clear plastic of the appliance. And it was a little bit startling too, because it's this sort of pinkish thing, and I'm realizing that it's a bit of my small intestine that's sticking out of my body now, and this bag is over it to collect the waste that comes out. So I'm seeing all these things for the first time, and it's a little bit startling. So I believe not too long after I woke up and was seeing myself in this new state, I believe an ostomy nurse had come in to check on me, and they talked a little bit about ostomy life. They gave me some paperwork, and we discussed briefly some of what it's like to have an ostomy. I think there may have even been a nutritionist at some point talking about what sort of things I can and can't eat, but we'll go over that in detail another time. But I'm meeting these people, and they're telling me a little bit about what to expect and how ostomy living is. But it's kind of funny because they're trying to give me these details of how to live with an ostomy relatively briefly, and I came to find that it took so much time, probably a year or so after this surgery, to really figure it all out. And when I'm meeting with these ostomy nurses, they're giving me a few little details here and there, but the learning process for an ostomy is still considerable. There was so much I had to learn on my own that I had to trial and error. And I'll get into some of that more even just in this episode. But they're telling me a little bit about ostomy life, and I'm trying to absorb it. And eventually comes the time, probably even that same day, in which I needed to empty my pouch for the first time. And I don't seem to recall missing the toilet or anything like that, but I basically had no idea how to empty this thing. I mean, I knew how it opened, but when you are so accustomed to sitting down on the toilet and doing your business, a normal way, and suddenly that changes drastically, it's a little weird. And it's not necessarily that intuitive as to how to manage it. And that was part of my learning process too. And spoilers, I'm going to talk about that in my Frontbutt Tip of the day. So I'm emptying it for the first time, my sort of first ostomy poops. And then within a couple days or so after that, still in the hospital, of course, I had my first appliance change. One of the ostomy nurses came into my room and said, we're going to change your ostomy appliance. And so I can learn how to do it, and they're going to help guide me along through that process, which was great because I had no idea what to do. This ostomy appliance was totally new to me, and they're telling me about how there's different sorts of pouching systems and this and that and another thing. And I'm slightly overwhelmed by it, but I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to listen in as much as I can, follow along, and hopefully I can learn how to do this thing, because once I leave the hospital, I'm going to need to be able to do all of this on my own. So, oh boy, I better get this straight the first time, because there might not be any more opportunities to learn and have someone that knows what they're doing at hand. That did not end up being the case, though. I did end up having a visiting nurse later on that would help me out with that for the first couple appliance changes at home. But we changed my appliance. I'm still lying in my bed, and we go over some of the basics there. And I'm just trying to soak in all of that process so I can get the hang of it. But one of the things that I found that helped me most when I was in the hospital in terms of picking up a couple little hints and tips and just hearing from other people's experiences was I actually got to sit in on an ostomy support group meeting that happened to be happening that same week that I was in the bigger hospital where I had my surgery. So I was told that this meeting was going to be happening. I was asked if I wanted to go, and I said, sure, yeah, I'll go. Actually, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit because there was a point in which I missed. Just after my surgery, I recall my surgeon coming into my room, and he was telling me that overall, the surgery went well. They put in the ileostomy and they removed the colon. But I remember him saying to me that my colon was in such bad shape from the ulcerative colitis and how it had progressed to this toxic megacolon state. It was in such bad shape that as he was removing it, it was tearing almost like wet tissue paper in his hands. It was that far gone. So it was really, really, really in bad shape. Aside from that tangent, sorry, I got a little off topic there. So I'm going down to this ostomy support group meeting, and I'm very much recovering. But I can still sit in my chair and listen to what they're going to talk about. And there were several other ostomates there, all older folks. That was by far the youngest in the room. But these folks were talking about some of their difficulties with having an ostomy, and I really don't know how long some of them had theirs. A couple folks, I think, seemed like they were maybe newer to having an ostomy, and others seemed like they had theirs for some years. So there was an interesting mix as far as I could tell. And of course, there was me that had just had mine for only a few days. So I got to hear some of the stories of these folks talking about having difficulties with their appliance at night, or even while they were in the hospital, and other sorts of things. But the main thing that I took away from the meeting was that when changing your ostomy appliance, you need to clean up the skin around your stoma, called the peristomal skin. And one of the best ways to do that is to just use a damp paper towel. But this tip that they said from, I think, one of the ostomy nurses was to use Viva paper towels. It's VIVA. And they're this very thick, plush paper towel that you dampen it, and when you're cleaning the skin around the stoma, it just holds up very well. It doesn't tear and all these things. And that was just a tip that I don't think I really ever would have picked up had I not gone to this meeting. And I still use those same paper towels to this day when I'm changing my appliance, because they work really well. So that was a really good tip that I picked up from the ostomy support group meeting, as well as just meeting some of these folks and hearing a little bit about their lives as ostomates. So it came to be about a week after my surgery that I was finally discharged from the hospital, which is pretty wild to me, seeing as that I had a very significant surgery, and I had quite a surgical incision. It was easily 6 inches surgical incision on my abdomen, and all these staples are still in as I'm leaving the hospital. But, that miracle of modern medicine, and I was cleared to be discharged. Actually, I got weighed before I left the hospital, but I had lost a lot of weight during this whole ordeal over the, say, 3+ weeks now. I was in the hospital for at least 3 weeks, plus several days prior to that of being sick before I even went to the hospital. And over that time, this time of significant illness, I lost a lot of weight. I think I went into the hospital weighing between 130 and 135 pounds, but I left at 107 pounds. So I lost a lot, and I was extremely skinny. And I even got some photos of me once I had gotten home where I just look like a skeleton with skin stretched over it. It was horrific. It was gross. Like, ugh, those photos were pretty bad. But I had them taken because I didn't want to forget. And that was important to me. I went through something that really, really took its toll on me physically, and I survived, but I wanted to remember, at least via photos, just how much it tore me down, and that it's something I could compare to once I was healthy again, too. So now that I'm home, I had a visiting nurse come to see me a few times because, as I had said a few minutes ago, I learned a few things to do with an ostomy, a little bit about nutrition guidelines. I had changed my appliance at least once. And I was sent home, too, with many packets of ostomy lifestyle help, how to change an appliance, how to care for your skin, dietary guides, and that sort of thing. But there was still so much that I didn't know, and I still felt fairly vulnerable in terms of taking care of myself and just knowing what I needed to do. So I remember the first night I came home, my dad had driven me home from the hospital, and we went to the grocery store. And I actually used one of the little motorized carts in the grocery store because I could barely walk. We're going around and we're picking out all these things from my list of suggested foods for an ostomate, especially since I was new out of the hospital. I definitely didn't want to eat anything I shouldn't, as it seemed like it was pretty strict as to what I should or shouldn't eat. But we'll talk more about ostomy nutrition in a later episode. So we go to the grocery store and pick out a bunch of foods and then come home. And a few days later, or a couple days later, I have my visiting nurse come to see me, and she helps me change my pouch again, and she's checking on my stoma and checking on my surgical site to make sure I'm recovering well, and all seemed to be just fine. I saw her again maybe 2 or 3 more times before it was deemed that I could probably handle myself from there. I was recovering well enough. And I did seem to start to recover well. Once I was home, I spent a lot of time lying down, not doing very much, reading or watching TV or some sort of thing where it was very, very little physical activity because I still had these staples in and I was still very, very weak for a few weeks. But I think it was about 2 weeks after I left the hospital that I finally had my staples out. My visiting nurse came to the house. She had a special staple remover, not like your office staple remover, but a special surgical staple remover, and she took my staples out. And at that point, I felt a bit like everything was behind me. Everything surgical related was behind me, and I could start moving forward. But the staples were out. I was starting to feel a little bit better. The surgery was behind me, and my life as an ostomy was ahead. So before we go into the proper front butt tip of the day, I have a little sub-tip that I want to get before we get into that. And that tip is to be cautious of opioid medication, which seems like a no-brainer because that stuff is very powerful. It is drugs, and they are very, very strong, be it morphine or Dilaudid. And for me, it was Dilaudid that I was on in the hospital, which is very, very strong. And I was sent home with an oral opioid medication. I can't recall exactly which one it was, but it was still fairly strong. And I was taking that over the next couple weeks or so after leaving the hospital. But one thing that I wasn't told very explicitly that I can recall is to wean yourself off of opioid pain medication. That stuff is addictive for one thing and can definitely lead to drug habits in the future if you aren't careful. But also, I had been on very heavy doses of opioid pain medication for the last 3 weeks to keep my pain in check. When I was released from the hospital, I was sent home with a prescription for this opioid medication. And they didn't very expressly say that I should start to wean down the dose. They said I could start taking a little bit less if I started to feel better, but they didn't really say to very distinctly step down the dose to get off of it. And I kind of found that out the hard way in that my pain was starting to reduce. I was getting better. I was healing. So I did start to take a little bit less, but I didn't really wean it off entirely. And eventually I take my last pill and I'm thinking, okay, this is fine, whatever. If I have further pain after this, they told me I could take Tylenol. But what happened is suddenly my body is in withdrawal for this opioid narcotic pain medication because I'd been on it for so long and at fairly high doses. And then for the next probably week or so after my medication ran out, I started to feel kind of sick again, simply because my body wanted that stuff to feel better. And I had developed some level of dependence on these substances. And I didn't even really realize that until I was off of it. And suddenly I have the shakes. Almost. I can recall my whole body sort of shaking, my hands shaking. And at one point I had a doctor's visit or some sort of thing where on my way home, I actually stopped by my work because they hadn't seen me in weeks and I wanted to stop in and let them know that I was okay. And I remember going in there and just shaking like a leaf on a tree. And I was telling them that I realized that it was the withdrawal from the pain medications and that I had no more of it and I had no intent of trying to obtain more. But it was a solid week of going through this, I feel sick again. I feel almost like I have a cold or the flu and I have these shakes because of this. So my tip for that is if they don't tell you to specifically wean yourself off very carefully, if they just say, if you're feeling less pain, you can take less. Sure, do take less if you're feeling less pain, but also don't just stop it immediately. In later cases, I found that I would have to slowly ration off the last several doses, taking them down, taking half pills at greater intervals and so on. So I was slowly weaning off of it, and eventually that worked. I'll talk in a later episode about why I needed to have pain meds again because of another procedure. But those things are dangerous. They do help control your pain when you're in the hospital and even after you're out of the hospital while you're recovering. But you got to be careful with those things because they can definitely lead to severe drug habits. And with that, that brings us to today's front butt tip of the day. So today's front butt tip of the day is a bit of a tutorial on how to empty an ostomy pouch. Ew, gross, I know. But it's something that all ostomates have to deal with. And it's not necessarily as straightforward as it might seem, and it's definitely a different process than what you're used to. Many of us go for several years of our lives sitting on the toilet, doing our typical business, and then when we have an ostomy, that changes. And for me, it took me a little while to realize that, because when I first got my ostomy, I still wanted to sit down and empty my pouch because I was so used to, I have to do a number 2. That means I sit down on the toilet and I empty this thing. But with an ostomy pouch, I have found that it's more difficult and more likely to create a mess if you try and sit down while emptying your pouch. So I find that standing up is just easier and it's less likely to create a mess. So I'm going to walk you through my typical steps for emptying a pouch so that maybe you might take a few tips for yourself and make it easier for you. That's what these tips are all about, making ostomy life easier. So first off, I would say just don't try and sit to empty it because it just tends to be more difficult, as I already mentioned. And if your appliance is quite full, it could be very difficult and you could actually spill on the floor. So step 1 is deciding if it's time to empty. And typically that is around 1/3 to halfway full of your appliance. Any more than that and your appliance can start to feel very heavy or even be cumbersome in how full it is. It may seem kind of weird to empty it at only half or even 1/3 full, but that's really the most ideal time to empty it. So first off, we've identified that we need to empty our appliance, or drain our appliance. It's a more common term. Next, when I get to the bathroom, what I like to do is what I call pre-rig my toilet paper, because once you have your appliance opened and drained, you need to hold it in one hand. You can't just let it go because it will potentially drain more material onto your pants, and of course we don't want that. So you need to hold it in one hand, and if you're trying to fumble with the toilet paper roll with your other hand, it definitely can be difficult. So before you even begin to try and empty it, take a few sheets off of your toilet paper, and I recommend a thick, quilted, soft type toilet paper, not a really thin single ply. Something like a thick Charmin is typically nice. That way even a single square is functional. I like to take about 3 squares or so of my nice thick toilet paper. I'm going to separate those 3, and I usually place them somewhere accessible, say on the top of the tank or on a surface nearby. That way, once I have emptied the material, I'll have that immediately nearby and accessible so I can grab that and start cleaning the opening of my pouch. So step 2, pre-rig your toilet paper. Step 3, we're going to get ready to drain our pouch. You're going to want to step up to the toilet, lift the seat, and you're going to want to lift your pouch up so that the opening at the bottom is facing more upwards now, because when you undo the closure, you don't want material to just immediately start spilling out. So tip the end up, open the enclosure. Then you're going to pinch the sides together a bit so that the mouth of the opening opens up. And then I'll step up to the toilet and I'm going to sort of kneel down onto one knee, lowering myself towards the bowl. Then I'm going to tip the bag down and drain out the material. Once all the material is out, that's when I'm going to stand back up, grab my toilet paper, my first sheet. I'm going to wipe the inside of the aperture to try and clear any material that's away right there. Then I'll continue with that process with the other 2 sheets. And usually for me, it only takes about 3 sheets or so to clean up the aperture enough so that it's clean that once I fold it back up and close it, there isn't any waste material in that folded section. You do typically, when draining it, you want to get fairly low, because if you're standing up too high, it can splatter a bit. So you want to get fairly low. But then if you are aiming directly, say, for the water, you might still get a little bit of splash. So I tend to aim a little bit more for the porcelain right by the edge of the water. But at least with an ileostomy, the material is very pasty and thick, and it can stick a bit. So you may want to flush actively while you're draining, or even have a sort of beaker or glass of water nearby that you can have some water in, so that once you have drained, cleaned the opening of your pouch and have it all cleaned up again, you can take this water and sort of wash the material off of the porcelain and into the water. Because sometimes even a flush doesn't move that material away. Sometimes, especially with ileostomy waste, it's very tenacious. It doesn't want to go away. So having a little glass of water or something nearby in a little receptacle, you can take that and sort of pre-rinse it down before you flush it. So there you go. you have emptied out your appliance, got it all cleaned up, and then just go ahead, flush it away. Of course, wash your hands, maybe open a window, put on a vent fan, spray a little deodorizer, especially with ileostomy waste. It's not totally digested and it is odorous. So I like to try and do whatever I can about it because it can be pretty bad. So that's it. Those are the standard basic steps for emptying your pouch. It's a little bit of a different process than your biological steps, but once you get used to it, it's pretty streamlined. All right, and really that's pretty much it for today's episode. Thank you for sticking around, and do tune in again next week. I will be covering a variety of ostomy-related topics over the coming sessions. So stick around, tune in again next week, and I will see you then. I'm Jameson Sizz, and I'll see you next week. This podcast is a Jameson Sizz production. If you want to learn more about the show, comment, or suggest topics for future shows, please do so at the Real Life Ostomy Podcast Facebook page or at RLO Podcast. Thanks for listening.